Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator of the Alliance for Livable Ontario. For those of you who are new to Livable Ontario, we're an alliance of people and groups representing hundreds of thousands of Ontarians from many different sectors. We want to build a livable Ontario, not just more housing, and we want to stop the provincial government policies that falsely claim they will solve the housing challenges facing us, while actually harming our communities and undermining the protection of our farmland, natural areas, and democratic institutions. First, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Alliance for Livable Ontario recognizes that its work and the work of its members take place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario, and we are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. We are thankful to the First Nations, to Métis and Inuit people who have cared for these territories since time immemorial and who continue to contribute to the strength of Ontario and to all communities across the province. The Alliance for Livable Ontario is also honored to collaborate with Indigenous colleagues, rights holders, and communities. Acknowledging traditional Indigenous territories is one way to recognize contemporary and historical Indigenous presence and land rights. It is a small step towards dismantling the continued impacts of colonialism and undoing Indigenous erasure in our everyday lives. Again, welcome to Getting It Right, Building the Housing We Need. This is the second webinar in the Building Hope series. We created this series because many of us feel hopeless given what's happening at Queen's Park. For well over a year now, we've been told that the best way to fix the housing challenges facing us is by building more sprawl-style housing on farmland, natural areas in the Greenbelt. Indeed, earlier this spring, the Premier called the Greenbelt a scam shortly after he introduced proposed changes to Ontario's planning laws that will effectively turbocharge sprawl on exactly the land that should be protected from sprawl. Meanwhile, report after report has shown there is more than enough land already set aside in existing towns and cities to build the diverse and affordable housing Ontarians need. Yet, the province is making it exceedingly difficult to build deeply affordable and other types of housing on these lands. And that's actually the key conclusion of our first webinar, which is available at the Alliance for Livable Ontario website, livableontario.ca. So it's understandable that many people feel hopeless and sad. But there's great news. And the great news is that the solutions we need to build a livable Ontario, especially to deal with the housing challenges we face, are all around us. They exist in the communities across Ontario, as well as in other parts of Canada and in the world. They are doable, real, practical, and affordable, which is why we created the Building Hope webinar series. We want to give you hope and inspiration to build a livable Ontario. We want to connect you with others, and we want to give you accessible information and tools about issues and solutions that are relevant to your daily life. Today, we focus on the housing we need and what we can do, what can be done by governments and residents like you and me to get this housing built. In a moment, we're going to hear from two experts who will give us some great bite-sized insights into the housing we need and how to get it built. This is this part of the webinar will be moderated by Margaret Profit, the Executive Director of the Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition. And that will go on until probably about 4:40 to 4:45. Then we're going to have a Q&A that will take us to about 5 o'clock. But first, let's get a bit of information from you via two Zoom polls. So let me hand it over to Margaret to walk us through the polls.
Thanks, Franz. So there's going to be two polls launched here to get to know a little bit about our audience today. One is for you to describe the housing situation that's for you. I own my own home, I rent my own home, co-op, not-for-profit, or other. And then there's a second question asking you about what the following situation, your affordability of your current housing situation. Don't worry, we're not going to tell the tax people on you. We just want to understand who is in our audience and what perspectives they might have.
And I apologize, there's a third question that
Oh, there's
should,
a third question there
just
too. Sorry.
ignore that. Yep, I mistakenly include, so just ignore that one.
Okay, just ignore the third question. I didn't see that, Franz. I'll scroll down. We have about 25% people responding, so we'll give a little bit. So far, we have, it seems like a larger majority are homeowners on here today. And it seems that so far, there are people here that, not a lot of people that know people that spend more than the recommended 30% on their household income on rent and mortgage payments. Okay, just another minute or so, if you don't mind, so we can get to most people. I know you probably weren't expecting this to be a participatory thing. These aren't hard questions, hopefully, for you, but we do appreciate your feedback. Susan is saying you can't ignore question 3 because it will not submit.
Oh, my apologies about that.
So you have to choose one, choice 1 or choice 2. Pretend it's like, let's make a deal. You don't know what's behind those curtains, but you have to pick one of them. And we can show that there's a donkey behind one of them at the end of the webinar, and there's a car behind the other. We'll see when we get that far. All right, we have just about 80%. Like I said, if you didn't do choice question 3, just take a second. I'm gonna stop the poll now, Franz, just so we don't need too much time. Okay, so most are homeowners, 65%, and most people know someone who is spending more than their 30% on rent or mortgage payments. And choice 1, everybody liked that one way better than choice 2. So those are your poll results.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And this is really useful information for us because it gives us a sense of who is here. And also, I hope, will help inform the discussion that's going to follow. On that note, I want to actually hand it back to Margaret, who will now moderate the next discussion. Margaret.
Thanks, Franz. I'll do my best because we have 2 highly esteemed people here in the housing world for different reasons. And let's get to know them a little bit better. First, we have Dr. Carolyn Whitzman, is a housing and social policy consultant. She is an expert advisor to the Housing Assessment Resource Tools, otherwise known as HART, project based at the University of British Columbia, and is the author of over 100 articles and book chapters. She has advised national, state, provincial, and local governments, UN Women, UN Habitat, and private and nonprofit organizations. Thank you, Carolyn, for being here.
Thanks, Margaret.
And then we have Leith Moore, who co-founded Our House Solutions Incorporated in 2018 to provide affordable housing solutions for urban families and allow them to self-solve their housing needs. Our House creates as-of-right solutions, and its products are panelized in a factory setting and delivered directly to the consumer for on-site assembly. And Leith was also a part of the Greenbelt Council way back when, another time with David Crombie. So I thought I'd mention that. Leith, I hope you don't mind. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. I used to be a lot of things.
Yes, I think we all have that in common. So today for the audience, I'm not sure how many of you have been engaged in housing discussions before, but as we did our pre-interview and kind of rundown about how this webinar was going to go, the conversation about housing is multi-layered. There's a lot of different approaches we can take to the housing, not only the solutions, but the reasons why. ALO is really interested in trying to give you the most manageable pieces of the housing solutions and the housing problems so that you can then take that to understand the issue better and be active within your local groups and organizations and communities. So we will not get to every single housing solution nor housing problem or housing theory, but we will try our best to give you the top notes of what our presenters see as key issues and where we can go from here. So please bear with us. This is a very meaty subject, and we're doing our best to just give you the highlights, if you don't mind. So on that, you both come from different perspectives within the housing with the housing market. I don't know if you would call it that, but the housing industry for different reasons. And I'm just wondering if we could talk about three things, if we were to summarize getting into those kind of bite-sized pieces of information, what are three things that people in the audience need to know about the housing situation that we're in from your perspective? And I'll start with you, Carolyn, if you don't mind, and then go to you, Leith, afterwards.
So, Margaret, the question is three things that the audience need to know?
Yep.
Okay, well, there are about 700,000 households in core housing need in Ontario. That means that they're paying more than 30% of their household income on rent or mortgage, and or they're overcrowded, and or they're in an uninhabitable house. And about 77% of those are low income. They're in the lowest income quintile. They can afford a maximum of about $1,000 a month rent, and there is none, zero, nada housing available at that cost in Toronto and Hamilton and across Canada. There are virtually no places for rent that can be rented by a person who's reliant on minimum wage, certainly in Ontario. So I'd sort of start off with that sort of harsh statistic just to frame the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you. And you said something the other day in our pre-interview, which I don't know if you'll say again, but in case you don't, I'm just going to remind you that you said it because it struck me as someone who comes from, environmental, if you will, background or advocacy piece. You had said, the housing crisis is very similar to the climate crisis as far as the speed and the intensity and the seriousness of it. I'm adding a few words, but that's kind of what I took from it. And that really shocked me of just kind of the situation that we're in, for sure.
The icebergs are definitely melting when it comes to the homelessness crisis. And really, I see the housing crisis and the climate change crisis as inextricably linked, because when people don't have homes, and this is also true of moderate income households as well as low income households, they drive or take public transit until they can find a cheap place. And that's one of the chief drivers of sprawl. And sprawl is one of the chief drivers of climate change.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And the people that are going to be most affected by climate change are going to be the people that are unhoused or in precarious housing where they don't have air conditioning or proper heating, and it goes on. So there is definitely an overlap there in that. Not to divert. Sorry, Franz. I know we weren't supposed to talk climate change, but I just thought Carolyn's point was so hard hitting for maybe people that don't realize it. Leith, what do you think about some three things or one or 2 points that you think people need to know about the housing situation from your perspective?
It's bad. It's very bad. It's very bad, not getting better. It has become a problem that, as we all know, affects more and more people. People used to talk about housing affordability, and it was like talking about assisted housing, government-sponsored housing. I think that the housing crisis has migrated upwards, much like rising water levels, to affect more and more people, and that the working folk are having a hard time affording housing. There's an interesting article in the past few days I saw where Habitat for Humanity is now funding people who are fully employed but can't afford housing. So that's just an indicator of how bad things are getting. And
I hoped you would bring that up, Leith, and I'm sorry to jump in, but the the minimum household income cutoff for Habitat for Humanity now for the project that they're doing in Waterloo is $70,000 a year. And that is 80% of median income in Waterloo. So basically those are median income households that are reliant now on a charitable organization to find an ownership home. So that's just a symptom. Sorry, Leith.
Yeah, no, perfect. It's great. I think that number, you might know, I think it's grown by in terms of what it is by
Mhm.
50% over the last 2 or 3 years. And interest rates are, are returning to what might have been at one time called normal. And we've been so used to almost free money. It's CMHC has raised their benchmark rate for rental housing, which without CMHC financing, you're not building rental. So all the indicators are bad and getting worse. And I think that governments struggle, people struggle to find solutions, and typically have turned to will increase supply. And I know that when I know David's on this call. Hello, Mr. Crombie. I sat on his panel that studied the Green Belt and the growth plan, and it was clear, as little as 5 or 6 years ago, there would not be a need to grow the urban boundary for a very long time. And yet here we are in an environment where not only the urban boundary within what's called the White Belt is, open for moving already. The Green Belt's being opened up for housing, and I'm one of those who, I'm a reformed builder and developer. I can tell you that the industry is good at production low-rise white picket fence housing, which is not sustainable and not climate friendly, and it will not generate affordable or even effective affordable housing for people. And I don't know any developer who's going to throw that land in at a hometown discount. I think that they will be market value, and market value is not going to address this housing crisis. On the other end of it, the industry is good at high rise and condos, and bigger is better, and more is will address affordability. But I think that we can see that over time, all that's happened is the index price has gone up to, in Toronto, is $1,400 a square foot, and the only way you kind of make it look quasi affordable is to make it, less than 400 square feet, and then the number looks good until you add in carrying fees and the rest of it. So we are not tapping into great solutions to it. We're tapping into things that we think we already know how to do, the industry knows how to do, and they're not good solutions.
Do either of you think that some of the solutions are based on kind of old paradigms about who struggles with housing, that like the idea that it's people that are unemployed, underemployed, that are the ones that are having the problem with housing? And now, as you guys both have said, we're dealing with older generations who can't afford to downsize. We're dealing with people that are fully employed that can't afford to find a rental or a home. Do you think that there's a place where we thought we understood who struggles with housing, we just haven't kept up to date, and therefore we're kind of building on that old narrative? Just as a thought.
I think that's part of it. I think that we're still building for a nuclear family that no longer is a predominant household form. So, I grew up with a single mom. My husband grew up with two parents and four kids. My household's a lot more common now than his household is, or was. Oh, I'm sorry. But absolutely, there is a housing shortage right now in Ontario. But I think what you're getting at, Margaret, what Leith was talking about, is that we really need to look at the question of who needs what kinds of housing where. So there is a tremendous need for student housing. There's a tremendous, near colleges and universities, there's a tremendous need for housing for all kinds of single people, young people, older people, etc. Not necessarily in condominiums. Again, it could be in communities, especially for older people who want to downsize. There is a tremendous need for long-term care, for group homes, for people with disabilities. And again, that needs to be everywhere, near public transit, near services. So there is so much unmet potential in the built-up part of cities right now. And we don't need very large tract houses in the suburbs very much anymore. We don't need that kind of cost-dependent sprawl. We need a renewed approach to using a city effectively, with a notion of missing middle that goes beyond duplexes and triplexes, because we're not going to duplex and triplex ourselves out of the housing crisis.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think why I was getting to that point was just thinking what both Leith and you have said, Carolyn, is, you know, that this idea of we're a little bit outdated, I think, of when I talk to neighbors, when I talk to older uncles and grandparents and that sort of thing, they still think of housing as that white picket fence. And in fact, Ford had said, everyone's dream is to have a little white picket fence. That is what they want. That's what we're going to provide. So his approach seems to be, let's get back to the housing that everybody has a dream of, which is white picket fencing. You're, Carolyn, talking here about housing is about long-term care home as well. It's also about transitional housing. It's also about rental. There's a much larger definition than the imagery of a white picket fence. And so I'm wondering, Leith, if you want to start with this and then maybe go to Carolyn, you know, this idea of let's get these more white picket fence houses built because that's what housing is and that's what housing is needed. And let the private sector do their thing. I know you mentioned it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could expand, what's wrong with this from your perspective? What's wrong with this idea of trying to build white picket fences and let the private sector do what it has to do and get government out of the way?
Well, industry likes to do what industry does. If it's a proven paradigm, you keep doing it. It ain't broke, don't change it. And then between financing and banks and contractors, the legal agreement, everything is built around what we've been doing for a very long time. So I started our house about 5 years ago, feels longer, but to try and adopt a small is beautiful approach and infill intensification, you know, create other paradigms and take advantage of changes that are out there in zoning that's coming, as you know, pre-approved as of right zoning for missing middle, to take advantage of new industrial technologies for off-site fabrication, faster, more cost-effective, less waste, on-site assembly to be faster on-site, and combine that kind of 3D BIM design and new technology of fabrication and build the planning policy that they've always had, which is, you know, 6-8 stories, 4 stories, 5 stories, and more of that middle solution that can create thousands and thousands of units. We don't have an industry that is equipped for it. I can tell you that it needs a lot of investment by government, not just in saying, hey, we're going to open up areas and create some subdivision approvals, but in actually supporting an industrial cluster, which includes fabrication plants using wood panels for CLT, and by doing those things, we can create more cost-effective mid-level housing that isn't high-rise, and actually generate a real impact, move the dial on housing that costs a little less, happens a lot faster, and makes more use of existing infrastructure that's in the ground.
Carolyn, do you have thoughts to add to this?
Oh, absolutely. So, you know, it does start with targets. There are these broad level targets that have been forcibly agreed upon by municipalities, but there are no sub-targets for instance, 2-3 bedroom apartments. There is no sub-target, certainly by income category. And that's the kind of thing, I'm doing some work now with the BC government. They have targets, but they also are putting money into nonprofit housing. And that's the next question. We haven't had a nonprofit, a specific nonprofit program at the federal level since the 1990s. And I would include the National Housing Strategy with the exception of the very small Rapid Housing Initiative. So that's 30 years of disinvestment. We have 650,000 homes, nonprofit homes across Canada, 600,000 of which were built before 2020. So clearly we have a huge deficit. And around the time that social housing fell off the cliff in the early 1990s, not coincidentally, homelessness started to increase. So we need the provincial government to support, for instance, acquisition strategies, which have just been announced in BC and in Nova Scotia. This is nonprofit acquisition of existing homes that are at risk of losing affordability. And we also need funding for supportive housing, not just transitional housing, but permanent supportive housing for people with disabilities, for instance, long-term care. And we need also a much better response from the provincial government when it comes to two things. One is social assistance rates, which haven't risen with inflation since the 1990s. And also, I forgot my train of thought. Yes, landlord-tenant relations, thank you, which evictions keep on increasing. In fact, there were 6,000 evictions that hit the landlord-tenant board at the time when the eviction moratorium related to COVID was lifted. So eviction should be an absolute last resort. They aren't. Recent research by my colleagues at UBC found that over 2/3 of evictions across Canada were no fault of the tenant, were for round eviction, dem eviction, or in the case of secondary rental, like in condominiums, saying that they were moving in or they were selling the condominium. So evictions are happening at a very fast clip. Legal aid's been cut back. Social assistance isn't enough to pay for any form of rent, including non-market rent. So there is a lot that the province can and should be doing to create the kind of supply that will meet the needs of Ontarians and will save money. I mean, Doug Ford says he's all about, monetary efficiency. Sprawl is infinitely more expensive than intensification. And homelessness is not only a social evil, it's also incredibly expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think just as we continue to talk, you start to see the complexity of housing. It's not just what the bricks and mortar are, right? Like there is a lot, like you're saying, with the social assistance, about how all of those things interplay together to provide homes for everybody at all different things. So to me, and whether, I don't know if both of you agree, I think you'd agree that when we focus on these simple solutions, like we're just going to open up more land and we're just going to get white picket fences for everybody, it allows people to focus on what they think is a very simple solution, which will work. Like we're just going to increase supply wherever we want to go, but it comes at the expense of actually looking at solutions that could be more cost efficient for government, more effective, more environmentally friendly, like it kind of detracts us from where we need to be looking and pushes us into oversimplification of an issue. Is that fair? Does everybody agree with that? Or
Sure, no, I don't think anybody should be surprised that any level of government looks for a simple solution or explanation for a problem. It's not new. It's not limited to the current government. It's true that we can only build so many houses a year the way we build them. If we can build in the province of Ontario, I don't know what the number is this year. I know in Toronto area, GTA, we can basically pump out 30,000 units a year. Not 32, not 30. So the idea that we're going to triple that number, it's not feasible. There isn't a labor pool. The labor pool is getting older and retiring. And it's getting increasingly expensive and hard to produce housing. There just isn't the labor. And so saying that we're opening up more land and that's going to create an affordability it's just a false promise. It's not going to happen. And the only way we're going to get more cost-effective housing is that if we can increase the productivity of the housing industry to build more. And until off-site fabrication came along, and it's just getting up, and I can tell you there's very little investment in it. The biggest improvement in technology for housing was the invention of the battery-powered portable drill. So you didn't trip over a cord. And that's the only thing we've really come up with for 30 years. So, we really do need to look at what kind of housing we create where, not just how much housing, because I think that's the key, is that you got to build the right housing in the right places, not just have policies that let the way we build, how we build, carry forward. We need to change that, flip that dial.
And at the risk of furiously agreeing with Leith, who I furiously agree with, I don't want us to get too caught up in the complexity and just go, whelp. Between 1964 and 1974, Sweden built 1 million homes. And the secret sauce there, as Leith will know, was just this total commitment to government land. Social housing absolutely was most of it, but prefab. So that's the basis on which IKEA was built. There were kitchens, they were a certain size, IKEA would furnish them. There were bathrooms, they were a certain size, IKEA would help. So it can be a tremendous source of economic, environmental innovation, housing, and it can be fixed. That was 1 million homes for 6.5 million people. The equivalent in Canada today would be 6 million homes. Singapore, after independence, around the same time, mid-60s, it had horrific housing conditions. It needed 147,000 new homes, the needs assessment found, and they built it in 10 years. They expropriated land. It was a very, I could go on and on about Singapore, but it was very government-led, and it built up one of the most prosperous economies in Asia. So I guess I'm saying two things. One is, don't get overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem. It can happen with strong political will. And the second thing that I'm saying is that it's eminently doable once you take a problem-solving approach.
And I guess you start asking yourself the right questions and measuring the right things. And it seems
who needs what housing where, and how are we going to provide it at a cost that people can afford? That part of it isn't rocket science.
Exactly. And we have to get past old narratives that say housing are only related to certain demographics and classes, and it's happening more and more across demographics, across classes, across different areas of the province. It's no longer just an urban issue. It's no, we really have to kind of update that. So I guess the what I hear you both saying is, unlike the current trajectory, which is let government get out of the way and break the rules so that there doesn't have to be a lot of oversight and we can just kind of build whatever, whenever, wherever, that actually we're kind of looking more for government to take a leadership role and kind of coalesce all of these needs into almost like a post-wartime effort of how we get houses built. Is that fair? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think that people need to lean into an industrialization strategy for housing. If the industry will do what it's doing, it will keep doing what it's fine. We actually don't need to open up new areas. We've got lots of land. What we are focused on mostly is entitlements and how fast somebody can get something approved, to the detriment of looking behind it and making sure that, well, are we putting houses where there are sewers and transit already, rather than having to hope one day it'll come. And if we want to unlock and create more, it's both by industrialization and letting we do it, what I call self-solved housing. Like, if I can get enough fabrication, I can give everybody in the province an ADU, a garden suite, for your children, to rent out as income for your parents. And it's quick to build, and it's the most cost-effective housing we can create. There's no new land cost, so it's just a creation cost. And places like Toronto have waived DCs and put as a right zoning in for it. They're not getting huge numbers yet. They will, but it's more related then to the fabrication industrialization ability that you need an industry to have prefab. Because relying on the occasional custom builder to build an overexpensive lane suite is not an answer. California was the first to sort of say it can be everywhere. Ontario, to their credit, have done that. It's there, but it's also overwhelmed by all, other initiatives. Let's just open up everything everywhere. I think that the ADUs and intensifications that they're also doing, together with more of a careful marshaling of the along the lines of the old growth plan, would be a better solution. And that there's tax policy that we haven't talked about. Literally, federal and provincial should be incentivizing rental, and HST, could be waived. They haven't changed the HST threshold since GST was introduced, I forget, 30 some years ago. It used to be a luxury tax. Now it's just a tax on everybody. And they changed the tax policy for rental housing in 1974, and it shut down rental in about 4 minutes. It wasn't rent control. It was the fact that you couldn't amortize losses of a new rental that takes forever to get up and running against one that was doing okay, and even it out and encourage investment in rental. So you've actually been a disincentive to build rental. You're better off doing condo. So it needs a really thoughtful, deep, deep insight approach to solving the problem. Just opening up lands won't do it. Just hoping that the industry will solve it won't do it. And we need all of these pieces brought together somehow.
Really everything, taxation, regulation, building code, zoning code, needs to be viewed through 3 lenses at once. Is it affordable? Is it accessible? Because we live in an aging society, and also a society where people with disabilities are much more likely to be homeless, along with Indigenous and racialized people. And greenhouse gas emissions, bring them down to 0. And you see in a lot of European countries, in Denmark and Germany and France, etc., all of the targets, all of the taxation, all of the financial policy, the national infrastructure banks, where you put pensions into, are going into that kind of triple bottom line approach of affordability, accessibility, and environmental sustainability. So it's not something that isn't being done in other places. It's just that Canada, who were leaders, I mean, people used to come to St. Lawrence neighborhood and go, "Sui, we'd love to do this." We can be leaders again instead of laggards when it comes to innovation in housing.
Absolutely. And locally, I try to work with a lot of councils talking about how their land use policy can be their key climate action, right? Where you build housing, what type of housing you build. And I had a conversation with a counselor ages ago, and I said, do you realize this new sprawling development on the outskirts, whatever, they were all going to be starting, now this was a few years ago, but they were going to be starting at $850,000, 50-foot frontage. And I said, do you realize you are building a community that's only accessible to probably about 25% of your population? Really, you're talking about people that can afford to drive, people that can afford, that can do stairs, people that, you are really narrowing who can live in your community, whether that's intentional or unintentional. I don't want to say, because who knows, but I don't know if people really think about trying to build a full community. And I really like how you brought in the different lenses, because from an environmental perspective, I think in the same way. Climate isn't just whether you recycle or not. Housing isn't just about whether you build or not. There's a lot of complexity into that. But similar to what you're saying, there's an opportunity for us to be leaders, and we can follow other places that have done this sort of innovation. It's not like it's a problem that hasn't been been looked at by other places and jurisdictions that have been doing well with it.
Yeah, and I see that the chat is coming up with lots of really great ideas. I do want to follow up on one, and that's the use of government land, and the fact that you should never, ever sell government land to private developers, especially what's happening right now with Metrolinx, where really transit-oriented land is being sold off to private developers with no expectation of affordability. It's like the Ontario government is a heroin addict and needs its next little money fix in order to build up a bigger hoard of money because it's already running a surplus. When you look at other jurisdictions, whether it's Montreal or Vancouver, etc., you see that government-owned land, including provincially owned land, is being used for nonprofit housing and is being maintained as affordability using community land trust models. And then you see Ontario, as I say, you know, I know in Parkdale, where I used to live, there was an LCBO that just was sitting there for years and years, and there were proposals to build nonprofit housing there, and the province wasn't playing ball, and now it's just being completely, you know, criminal when it comes to metro links and air rights above stations. That's exactly where we should be seeing big purpose-built rental, preferably nonprofit projects. So, you know, why are they selling off this communal resource? It's like selling the seed corn, you know, just don't do that.
Mhm. So just to finish off, because I know that Franz has lots of questions, I'm sure that the audience has posed, and I want to give everybody a good chance. So we have talked about the government being more of a leader in this, taking the opportunity to really take the housing issue, the complexity of it, which isn't impossible, but to really see it our way through economically, industrializing it. There's a lot of opportunity in the crisis, if you will. You were speaking to someone, a government official at any level, who's like, yeah, you know what would be the first good step I could take? And that could be something really benign or something much more important. What would you say would be something that an elected official could take as my first step in making sure that I'm a part of the solution with this? And I'll open up to either one of you, whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll give you one, and it's to make the biggest immediate impact, unleash the self-solved housing, the moms and pops, infill and intensification, get some creativity going with people doing things that are not, having to be done through a developer with a profit on top of a profit. I would immediately reform HST policy for rental housing and ADUs and get rid of it. You will find that is it's about depending on the product, $20 or $30 a square foot impact on tax at the end. And it right now moves the dial from a rental project being uneconomic to being economic. Done.
Thank you. What about you, Carolyn, from maybe a more...
That's really concrete.
affordable?
I'm sorry to say that I'd start off with a slightly more abstract thing, which is that there need to be targets that are attached to a real definition of affordability that has to do with people's incomes. When you use market rate, that's doubled in the last 7 years, whether you're talking about rental or home ownership. It's meaningless to use market rental affordability that results in homes that are only affordable to higher income people being considered affordable. So you start off with a definition of affordable for low income people, for moderate income people, and then you provide, you kind of reverse engineer, what's it going to take to create a place that's $1,000 a month? Because there are, literally hundreds of thousands of Ontarians who need places at less than $1,000 a month. And you start there and you come up with targets that are related to incomes, to household sizes, and to various priority populations, such as Indigenous people, who are so much more likely to be in homelessness. And then you do the regulatory, you do the financial, you do the necessary in order to make sure that everyone has a home. It's a rights-based approach. We're supposed to be doing it. We're not doing it.
Yep. Thank you. Well, to Leith and Carolyn, my time with you is done. I could have probably continued this for another hour or more, but I really appreciate it. And I know that Franz, there's people already in the chat saying, well, what can we do about this as citizens and organizations? So I'll turn it back to you to handle the hard questions. And thank you, everybody, for giving me your time.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Margaret. So yeah, lots of questions. Some of them have kind of been addressed, but I'm going to go through the ones that are here. And actually, this is from. I apologize if I'm. Well, I'm not going to say names this way. If I massacre them, well, I don't massacre them. To Leith, missing middle below 6 stories will be built by mom and pop, small developers, not large developers. How do we change the process to make it work better for them? You gave an HST example. I actually built, or my partner and I built a laneway house, and we're still waiting for our HST rebate a year after we had submitted it. Is there another suggestion about how to allow mom and pop small developers to build more missing middle? What can governments do? What can people do?
Well, we need as of right zoning, and we need a simpler site plan approval process. We need to make it less complex for people to get in there. If you want to go build your own building, you need $150,000 worth of money, of funds, just to make an application, and it's crazy. And navigating the process. So there are things that could and should be done in every town and city in the country to allow 4 to 6 story projects happen, almost like on a pattern build. Like, we've seen them, we know them. You don't need, just go get a building permit. Why do you want to fuss about all the details on something that small? Save your planning energy for bigger issues.
Okay. Carolyn, a question which is very much related to your expertise. Person asks, how do we convince required developers to build affordable housing when their profit margin will likely not be as great as that for luxury homes?
But I don't think you can force private developers to build low and moderate income housing. I think that everyone from the World Economic Forum to McKinsey consultants to pick a actual person who's looking at evidence, they know that you don't ask the private sector to build low income housing. It doesn't happen. So until Canada moves from the dial from 3.5% of total housing stock, which is where we are now, to closer to 20%, which is where France is headed, Finland is at, many other countries are at, we're not going to be solving that particular problem. I'm not a fan of inclusionary zoning. I'm not a fan of development contributions. I consider them a way of punishing newcomers to pay for infrastructure that everyone needs. There is absolutely no alternative in my mind to direct government either provision or funding nonprofits to provide low-cost housing.
Great. Leith, this is a question I think touches or gives you an opportunity to expand on a comment you made earlier. What new measures can be taken to increase the productivity of the housing industry, that is, to lower the cost of housing? You talked a bit about building it off-site. Maybe you can go a bit more into that.
Yeah, what I've been doing is pre-designing a known solution that can be repeated. Our industry is based on every house, every condo, everything is a new design. Sorry, architects who take way too much money out of the system and take too long designing it. And so having, it's like, the old wartime bungalows that came out. It was like built thousands of them in a go.
There were like 5 designs. They just went plop, 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 plop.
Yeah.
And they built 1 million homes. And it was an amazingly successful program with a fatal flaw. They sold those homes. So the homes that were sold for $2,500 or $3,000 in the early 50s are selling for 2 million now. So you have to keep that kind of permanent affordability through a land trust or another model.
Yeah, you can comb out, a good 8% of cost by not doing new designs every time. And the other thing that comes with that is now you design them, it's called DFMA, design for manufacturing and assembly. You design deliberately that it's cost effective, design effective, material effective to be repeated, the structure and so now that gets cheaper every time you print one. And the trades who are doing it can roll from one to the other. They know what they're building. That the 50% of all contingency of all labor costs in every new building is contingency. It's what if the hoist breaks? What if there's a conflict between a stud and a mechanical run? And so that's built in. And as a protection against margin. If you're building something that's repeatable, that goes down and you get faster. And so there's lots of ways to do that. That's the key, is that industrialization approach. Doesn't mean you can't clad them with parametric design and computer tools. You can make things look endlessly different without changing the inherent cost basis. And we're not capturing that. Our whole design process is, urban designers saying, how can you make a blindside wall look better? Let's spend money there. When the next guy builds a building, you'll never see it, but let's, spend $50,000 on it. And priorities are a little bit need to be looked at in terms of that kind of entitlement view too.
Right. We have two questions that kind of get at the issue of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism. One person writes, it strikes me that the new constraint will be people's response to exactly what you were talking about, Leith, IKEA standard housing. Just as the concept of the Greenbelt was not loved immediately, these concepts need to be promoted. And another person writes that building units, or that we have to address the NIMBY mindset. Building units in and around existing locations with established infrastructure is feasible, but there will be resistance. Maybe I could ask both of you, starting with Carolyn. You've done a huge amount of work in support of governments promoting truly deeply affordable housing. Obviously, NIMBYism isn't just an Ontario problem. Are there lessons learned from other jurisdictions that we should apply here? And if so, what are they?
Well, I mean, to speak to what Leith was saying earlier, we just have to stop treating every single housing proposal as something that we can debate for 6 months, 3 years, take it to the Ontario Land Tribunal. There should be much, much more as of right zoning. I am certainly, and as a planner, as a professional planner, a fan of a residential, a low-rise residential zone that is 4 stories, doesn't say how many units, because right now, as Leith says, we have a 4-story, 50-unit supportive housing prefab model that can fit on 1 or 2 city blocks, 1 or 2 city lots, I should say, and can be plopped up super quick. So that should be allowed everywhere. In fact, I would even argue for a 2-story density bonus if it's nonprofit housing. That should be the low end of zoning. And then when we get closer to bus stops or to rapid transit, we should be bringing it up to 8 to 12, for instance, or in the case of subway stations, 20 to 30. Let's not have some kind of huge bargaining session with every single development. How much DC can we get out of it? How much development charge can we get out of it? How many open houses should we have, kind of thing? That's nonsense. People have a right to housing. They don't have a right to say who their neighbors are going to be. And we have to accept the tough truth that zoning has been exclusionary. It has been racist and classist and ableist and homophobic and everything in its maybe not in its intent, but certainly in the way that it has rolled out. If you have neighborhoods that only allow single family homes, or even only allow at this point, with the land prices being what they are, duplexes and triplexes, you are excluding people who have a right to the same access to jobs and services as you do. And I think it's very difficult for older people, and I'm an older person, and homeowners, and I'm a homeowner, to sometimes understand that the situation is so different than it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when we were able to get on the home ownership ladder. It is impossible right now unless you can go to the bank of mom and dad and get a very big down payment to ever own a home. And we need to do 2 things. We need to build up a lot of secure rental that people can live in and other ways to invest money in. And also we need to create smaller homes that people can afford to live in.
Great. And Leith, final word to you. Any lessons learned from how to handle NIMBYism?
as a bank of mom and dad, I would say that, yeah, just pre-zone the heck out of everything. Now, the thing is that NIMBYism has been so prevalent, it is actually, it's the pendulum has swung a little bit away from us, in a sense that I think that what it leads to is, well, if we're going to have NIMBYism, and if Toronto ain't doing it fast enough, the province is going to say, well, why don't we just make everything, there's an application for a 50-story tower at Pape and Danforth, and that will be considered appropriate. So be careful what you oppose, because sooner or later the dam breaks. And I think that we're in danger of going too far, to, as of right, too much in the wrong places. And so there is a need for a really careful, appropriate planning-based approach for middle density housing everywhere. I just came back from Berlin. I would move there in a flash if I could speak German. One of the most perfect. Well, we bombed the heck out of it, so they rebuilt a big chunk of it. But what they've redone is lovely, and it's very 5-story, 6-story, tons more dense than Toronto overall, and it just shows you what you can do with the appropriate use of good policy and good building.
But there's so much pressure right now. As long as we don't have 4 to 6 stories as of right in every built up residential area, we're going to have, 50 stories being proposed on the few sites where it seems like there's going to be less opposition, and or where there's an ambit claim, shall we say, from a developer, where they start with 50 because they know they're going to end up with 20,
It's the Russian doll thing. We used to do that. Yeah. I was guilty of it. I knew I was negotiating, so my real building was hidden carefully underneath it. It's interesting to think that we're just like 100 and 200 years behind a lot of European cities, and they didn't start out being 6 and 8 stories everywhere. They started off as 2 and 3 stories everywhere, maybe a little denser, but they had suburbs too. They've all been redeveloped as they've grown, and they just had a good planning paradigm, I think, to get the right solution in that's quite livable.
Right. Well, what a great discussion. Thank you so much to all of you who joined us with your questions. Thanks to Carolyn and Leith for your great insights, and thanks to Margaret for being a great moderator. As you know, this is the second webinar in our Building Hope series. I hope we've inspired you today to join us again, and you can learn more about the series and how to sign up at our website. I'm going to be sending out details about the next webinar, as well as the link to this recording sometime in the next short while. 2 more things though before we go. We've got a Zoom poll to help us make sure that these webinars actually help you. So Margaret, if I could ask you just to get those 2 polls up. I'm hoping Margaret is still there.
Oh yeah, I'm still here. I'm just
okay.
Here we go. So how useful did you find this webinar, and has this webinar given you hope? And no sneaky third choice.
Well, thank you. It's been fun being here. And Margaret is a great moderator. And
thanks, Leith.
And I would put Carolyn in charge of our economic policy for housing tomorrow.
And I would make Leith the chief architect, or we're done. Especially
we'll
all the nasty things you said about architects, I would definitely make you chief architect.
That's cruel.
So while those poll results are coming in, and maybe we'll just go another moment or two, because we've got really good results so far. In fact, we'll just share them, and there they are. Thanks very much for your feedback. This is helpful. If you like this webinar and want to help us hold more of them, please consider making a donation now. We are affiliated with the Small Change Fund. They're a charitable partner, and I've just put the link to the Small Change Fund website, and you can go there and make a donation. Your donations will ensure that we continue our efforts to build a livable Ontario, to get the information out there that people need to know, to make it clear that there are real solutions, and that and they're doable. Finally, this recording will be available on our website probably by early next week. So please share the link with others, and don't forget to sign up and become an Alliance member if you aren't already one. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish you all a good afternoon, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Ciao.